Welcome back to the Fantasy Network, everyone. My name is, of course, Jimmy Nuts, and today is my favorite day of the year here on YouTube, and that is whenever I look at an entire calendar year, and I pick out some year-end award winners, and I give you my top 10 books of the year. This is obviously for 2022, and I'm excited for 2023, but this was a monumental year for many, many reasons. Obviously, we hit 10,000 subscribers here on the channel, which I can't thank you all enough for, but also I feel as if my reading taste has expanded past its limitations, and I have read outside of fantasy, outside of sci-fi, read some classics, and even in fantasy, right? The broad spectrum that is that genre, I have found some new favorites, and that is always an excellent feeling as a reader. It's what we aim to do, right? To find that next addiction. And there were many, many of those here in 2022. I'm going to go through some year-end awards, and then we will jump into the top 10. I will have a bit of an honorable mention as well, because this year was absolutely stacked with good books. I had 15 that I wanted to kind of narrow down into 10. I could have done a top 15, but honestly, I kind of like putting the pressure on myself. And I do stress out over this video just because, you only get one chance to make it right. This isn't like a living list that I can update every year. This is solidified in Fantasy Network history. So it is important to me. This list of top 10 are going to all be first-time reads. That means that there will be no rereads on the top 10 list, as well as only listing one book per author, or the top 10 would be a lot more boring because it'd be a lot of the same, because there are some authors that were just head and shoulders above everyone else for me this year. And then the year-end awards are just random categories that I have picked. But without any further ado, let's jump in to these year-end awards. The first year-end award I'll be handing out here in 2022 on the Fantasy Network is going to be my favorite completed series, meaning as far as we know, these series are completed, finished, and I read them in the year of 2022, or at least completed them. And the three candidates, and I'm not going to give candidates for every award, but this one was razor tight. This is the second most stressful decision I had to make for these awards and for this top 10 list. And the three candidates are The Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu, R. Scott Baker's The Second Apocalypse, and Malazan by Steven Erikson. They all hold a very special place in my reading journey and experience, and are very, very different from each other. In some ways similar, but stand out on their own. But the one that I had to pick is the one that resonated with me the most, the one that made me think, the one that would not let me go, and that is The Second Apocalypse by R. Scott Baker. This series just is written in a way that I feel it. It's heavy on my chest, and the style in which it was written is, what really puts it for me head and shoulders above a lot of the other stuff that I have read. I will say this, though. Prince of Nothing, I thought was great, but it didn't have that big lasting impression on me. Some parts did, but Aspect Emperor, which is what I ended up reading this year, really changed this all. It has so many inspirations from other works that I ended up loving, and sent me down a rabbit hole of looking into the influences for The Second Apocalypse. So overarching entire series, The Second Apocalypse will win my favorite completed series of 2022. Now, on the flip side of that, let's give out an award for my favorite ongoing series of 2022.
Let me guess, A Song of Ice and Fire?
No, it cannot be A Song of Ice and Fire, because it was a reread, and also it's ongoing, but who knows, right? Who knows? No, I'm going to pick something a little bit fresher, something that's a little bit newer, and that is The Sun Eater by Christopher Rocchio. I started this. This is probably my highest priority for 2022 whenever this year began, and it did not let me go the whole way through. I will say the first three books absolutely blew me away. I think I gave all of them 5 stars. I just really loved this series and had no problems being immersed in this, especially from that chronicling tale, first-person perspective, where you're kind of getting an awesome dynamic of present day Hadrian telling you a story about past day Hadrian. So there's like growth there and a lot of reminiscence from the narrator, which I really, really enjoy. I will say Kingdoms of Death was a step down for me in almost every single way from the first 3. I didn't think it was a bad book by any means, but it did not live up to how amazing I thought Howling Dark and Demon in White were. But regardless, I have not got the Ashes of Man, book 5, that did come out right at the tail end of this year. But I will be getting to that in early 2023. And then there's one book after that. So for an ongoing series, I'm just excited about what Christopher Rocchio is doing in this series. It's also one of those things where a lot of people seem to be resonating with it, and it is fun to chat about it with people. This is one of those series that you can definitely get lost in a conversation on, and it also has some amazing influences such as Dune, Book of the New Sun, and many, many others. So for me, Christopher Rocchio's Sun Eater series is my favorite ongoing series for 2022. Favorite audiobook performance, and this is going to go to, by a slim margin, Jonathan Keeble's narration of The Warlord Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell. This trilogy is fantastic. I had a blast. It is one I will listen to over and over and over again. And I have to say, I think Keeble elevates this work for me. Like, the performance of it definitely impacted how much I enjoyed Enemy of God, Excalibur, The Winter King. And Keeble is someone that I wish did more. Like, if I could pick one person to pick up the Song of Ice and Fire narration, if they were ever to re-record them, I would pick Jonathan Keeble. I think he is absolutely fantastic. There was a lot of stiff competition this year, like I said, but for this, I just had so much fun listening to Jonathan Keeble and his wild, wild voices. And there's a lot of over-the-top characters in Warlord Chronicles, and he brings them to life, and he really lives up to what they could be, the potential of those characters to be just bombastic. He nailed it. Loved it, slowed down at the right moments, had a lot of range, just an excellent performance by Jonathan Keeble, and I would recommend them to you if you haven't listened to them yet. Now, this is a new category for 2022. This was not on my 2021 or my 2020 awards, but is one I wanted to do because there was a lot of surprise this year. So this category is the biggest surprise for me as a reader in 2022. I was going to pick Stoner by John Williams. I was really close to picking it, but to be honest with you, I wasn't sure what to expect from Stoner. So I didn't feel so much surprised as I was just delighted that I ended up loving it so much. So I'm actually going to switch it up a bit, and I'm going to pick, for the biggest surprise of 2022, We Ride the Storm by Devin Madsen. This book was weird. It is multiple POVs from a first-person perspective, and there are tons of beheadings, lots of action, but I actually found the style of the writing to be really good, and it clicked with me on a personal level, and for my subjective taste, I had a blast reading this book. I do not think it's perfect by any means. I put out a review for it where I kind of talk about some of the wonkiness with the pacing, some character decisions that felt kind of asinine to me, or at least painted characters in a light where I felt like they looked like jackasses whenever they were not maybe supposed to be jackasses. But regardless of all of this, I was not sure what to expect from We Ride the Storm. This was a patron pick from my friend Joe Bot, and I ended up getting way more out of it than I thought I would. And I'm surprised that more people have not read this and talked about this on BookTube. It's a bit shocking to me for the sole fact that I feel like people who really enjoy John Gwynne or Bernard Cornwell, like this is kind of in that same vein. But I would even say that I like the writing style just a wee bit more. So I would love to see more people check this out. And this was an absolute surprise for me and just edged out Stoner just barely to win the biggest surprise of 2022. Favorite character of 2022 was a tight race as well. Last year, it was a blowout from Fitz Chivalry Farseer. That was easy. He's my favorite character in fiction of all time. But there was some crazy candidates for this year, but one that I feel has kind of captivated me in my mind and hasn't let me go, and is one that is, reverberating in my experiences in reading, and is something of a legend in literature.
You're far too kind. You're flattering me.
Well, Bobby B, you're one of my favorite characters, but it was not you, unfortunately.
I'm getting real sick of this shit.
My favorite character from 2022 is Judge Holden from Blood Meridian, a legend in fiction, a legendary villain, antagonist, god, devil, force of nature, man, myth. I could go on and on. I don't know what Judge Holden is. I don't know what his goals truly were in Blood Meridian. But every single time Judge Holden appeared on a page in Blood Meridian, it was a standstill. Everything kind of went quiet in my room, and I was lasered in on his dialogues or his heinous actions. And Judge Holden represents something bigger than a character and bigger than characterization. And a lot of, literary critics will stay away from characterization for the most part. Like, I'm talking about professional critics. But when you look into some of the criticism and the reviews and whatnot that you've seen Blood Meridian, they seem to want to dip their toes into talking about Judge Holden and his characterization. And I think that that's for the sole fact that he's one of, if not the best character in all of fiction, especially from a deep philosophical point of view and what it means to be man and human and everything else. And I could ramble on and on and on and on and say everything that that's just been spinning in my head as I read this book over the last 2 months, but I'll stop. And I would challenge you to check out Judge Holden and be grossed out by him and, disturbed as much as I was. But Judge Holden, without a doubt, is one of the most evocative characters that I have ever read in any book ever. And before we jump into the top 10 list and a little bit of an honorable mention, I want to give a shout out to my manga of the year. I finally started to read manga this year. Never had been exposed to it before this, and I read some good stuff. Vinland Saga, Berserk, Full Metal Alchemist. There's a bunch of other stuff that I've kind of dabbled in. But the manga of the year for 2020-22 is not Berserk. Surprisingly, I love Berserk. It has a special place in my heart. But Monster. I think it is literally one of the best stories that I have ever read. I did watch some of the anime. It was great. But just reading it, the art, the storyline, the dialogue, the themes, all of it is excellent with a lot of historical influence. It is high drama, kind of like a psychological thriller. And for people who are watching this, because most of my channel are book readers, I would implore you to check out Monster. I think it is absolutely fabulous. I'm not big on live action adaptations for manga and anime. If there was ever one they should do, though, it should be Monster, and it should be on HBO, and they should just give everything they got, because I think it would be a absolute banger of a TV show. And the anime is great, the manga is amazing, and it is my winner for manga of the year for 2022. With all that out of the way, it is time for the top 10 list of the year, but I did want to give some honorable mentions. Again, this is one book per author, no rereads, which rules out It, A Song of Ice and Fire, all the Tolkien stuff I reread. All that's out of the picture. But I did want to give out a shout out to some of the honorable mentions, one being Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang, Station 11 by Emily St. Mendel, Enemy of God by Bernard Cornwell, and surprisingly not making the top 10, but in the honorable mention is Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. It was a stiff year. I mean, it was razor tight. These books at any other day, maybe they make the top 10. And the order of this list has changed 4 or 5 times, especially number 1. But I feel good about what we're going to be going into. And without any further ado, let's jump in.
Number 10. A man builds a castle to keep others out, but this castle Galen knows, as sure as the thump of his heart in his chest, was built to keep something in.
Number 10 is Hellmouth by Giles Christian. Hellmouth is a short story novella. It could take you an afternoon to read. The audiobook is only an hour or 2, I believe. Maybe it's 3 hours. Absolutely fantastic. I listened to the audiobook on a plane. This takes place in 14th century Bohemia. There is a mercenary band that is hired to go check out this spot, and it is medieval horror, which I did not know existed, and I didn't know I loved so much. This is on this list simply for the fact that the atmosphere that this book brings in such a short amount of time is incredible. I could feel the steel moving when it would scrape against the rock of a castle. I could hear it. I felt fear, actually, in this. Like, it is a bit paranormal in some ways, very hellacious, and I just thought that it captured this time in this period in history so very well, while still being horror and still being medieval, having knights. I mean, this is just an awesome novella. It would only take you a little bit of time to get through. Probably one of the most underrated things that I've ever talked about here on the channel, and I should talk about it more because I think it is excellent. Giles, I'm not sure. I'm going to say Giles. Giles Christian is someone that I'm going to read more of. I know he has his Lancelot book. He's got a Vengeance trilogy. It's like a Viking type trilogy. I'm going to read more from this author, but it will be hard for him to top Hellmouth. Hellmouth was absolutely awesome and deserves the 10th spot here on this list.
Number 9. Freedom is a heavy load, a great and strange burden for the spirit to undertake. It is not easy. It is not a gift given, but a choice made, and the choice may be a hard one. The road goes upward towards the light, but the laden traveler may never reach the end of it.
Tombs of Atuin by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is book 2 in Earthsea. We get a switch in protagonist and main character. This book, just like Hellmouth right before it, has a ton of atmosphere, but also very, very rich themes. It is written in a style that is approachable, digestible, but is not stale, is not boring, is not commercial. Still elegantly woven. Sentences that make you think and really put you in the place of this main character. And there's a wonderful twist in this book that I thought was just excellent, connecting it to the larger picture of Earthsea. I read the first 3 books of Earthsea this year, and Tombs of Atuin was the best. I happen to be someone apparently who loves book 2s, because there's book 2s all over this list. But Tombs of Atuin is just Ursula K. Le Guin, for me, in the books that I've read by her, at almost her best. And I'm excited to get more into her sci-fi works as well. But for this, I just read this. I think I gobbled it up in like 2 or 3 days. It is very short, but very impactful, and is still... It's just so impressive what Ursula K. Le Guin is able to do in such a short amount of pages. She is economical with her style and her prose and her world building, and I wish more authors could do this. But they can't, because she is one of a kind.
Number 8. Art is something that you choose to make. It's a bringing together of everything around you into something that makes you more human, more Kepri, whatever. More of a person.
It's Perdido Street Station by China Miéville. I did a review for this on this channel, and I talked about a lot of the flaws that I found with this book, how conflicted I felt about the ending. But when I look at the grand scheme of 2022, there is nothing that is even in the realm of Perdido Street Station, with how weird it is, the amazing writing that I found with it, and also just the messiness of the plot and the grimness, and it's gritty and it's gross. Yeah, I don't know. Something special about Perdido Street Station, and I cannot seem to get over China Miéville's writing style. I just think that he's absolutely fabulous, a master of his craft, as I always say. But Perdido Street Station is on here simply because it stands out on the landscape of the genre, and I'm excited to get to more works by China Miéville in the future.
Number 7. But the ugliness of the world does not fade, and fear and grief are not made less by time. We are only made stronger. We can only float together on their tides as otters do, hand in hand.
And that is Howling Dark by Christopher Rocchio. Book 2, another book 2, in the Sun Eater series. What else can I say? I kind of talked about Sun Eater a little bit before, and I was talking about my favorite ongoing series. But Howling Dark, for me, was where Rocchio took some of the biggest risks in the series. And Demon in White was a great book, a great novel, and a fabulous entry to the Sun Eater series. But Howling Dark was just a little bit different. And when I talk about risks, there's a way that he opens up this second book. And a lot of readers I've seen are like, Howling Dark is a great book, except for that beginning is a little bit weird. But hearing Rocchio talk about the beginning of the book and what he was aiming to do, before I even knew that, it actually had worked with me. So it was a risk to do that. And then he takes an even bigger risk towards the end of the book that I left my jaw on the floor, quite honestly. Slow, methodical, but with some amazing climax sequences and decisions for this story and the character of Hadrian Marlowe that make Sun Eater. Empire of Silence is a great introduction. Demon in White is, balls to the walls, fast-paced, relentless at times. But I think without Howling Dark, the secret sauce is removed. So Howling Dark to me is the best of the series so far. I have not read Ashes of Man yet, but Howling Dark is the 7th slot here on the best books of 2022, and probably could have been a little bit higher.
Number 6. The vilest of men and the wickedest of women likewise may do good from time to time, for love and compassion and pity may be found in even the blackest of hearts.
Number 6 is a book that I had at number 1 at one point. And I had to kind of talk myself out of it a little bit, because I want to make something very clear. This list is not objective. It is just the number 1 piece of criteria for this list is how much did I enjoy it? Like, enjoyment above all. I do look at writing styles. I do look at the place in the genre, influence, all these things, but it comes down to enjoyment. And I may not have enjoyed a book more than this, but I did not feel right putting in the number 1 slot. So it is here at number 6, and that is Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. Maybe my favorite author of all time, as you know. Yeah, Fire and Blood was an absolute pleasure. I knew I was going to like it because it's Westeros, but whenever someone tells you it's going to be like a history book, right? A fantasy history book, how exciting or entertaining could that be? Well, it turns out for me, super exciting. Even past my fanboyism for the series, it being my favorite series of all time. I found myself not being able to put this down, but also never wanting it to be over. And I'm at a point now, don't roast me, okay? Listen, if he put out Fire and Blood 2, I'd be annoyed that it wasn't Wins a Winner, but I would be a liar to say I wouldn't be in line picking that thing up at midnight if they had a midnight release for it, because I want Fire and Blood 2 now. It is what it is. I thought it was excellent. I thought it was fantastic. I am a fan of history. I'm not a history buff, but I do enjoy history in my free time, and seeing it through the lens of the person who's crafted my favorite fantasy world, I mean, it's just excellent. I loved it. I thought the unreliable narrators, the multiple POVs, or I shouldn't say POVs, but the multiple historians, and then you throw in Mushroom, it's just great. It's fantastic, and I love Fire and Blood, and also House of the Dragon also, obviously helped out that enjoyment quite a bit.
Number 5. A poet marshals the words and phrases and stanzas for the purpose of moving the listener's heart. An engineer marshals components and devices and effects for the purpose of changing the world.
Wall of Storms by Ken Liu, Book 2. Again, another Book 2 in the Dandelion Dynasty. This was my book of the year at the halfway point in the year. There was some recency bias in that. I put out a rave review for Wall of Storms here on the channel. It was a raw, finish the last page, flip on the camera type review, which I rarely do because I never want to be too hyperbolic and have to walk things back, because I do want to be consistent. I stand by my review. I said it's one of the best book 2s that I read. I love the climax, had some of my favorite moments in fantasy, and I still believe that. And I hope it being at number 5 shows you just how ridiculously hard this top 10 list was, because there's even chances that stuff above this could have slipped in, whatever. But Wall of Storms was so fun, but beyond that, also so impactful. Very distanced characters, right, in the first book in Grace of Kings, and Wall of Storms brings it into a little bit more of an intimate setting. And then Ken Liu crushes you, and also just happens to be, in my opinion, amazing at building up some sort of like grand battle. And a lot of players in that battle too, a lot of different POVs, and it's just kind of amazing to me, the scope in which he was working with already in book 2. And Wall of Storms elevated the series in every single way for me, and this is where it kind of becomes more of a generational drama, a generational series, and that's something I would like to see a lot more of in fantasy, but they would have a hard time convincing me that they were going to be able to stand up next to the Dandelion Dynasty. I will say Wall of Storms, for me, is the peak of the series. I've kind of decided that I like Wall of Storms, Grace of Kings, Speaking Bones, then The Veiled Throne. So there is something to be said about, a series peaking halfway through, but that's just me. I know a lot of people who don't feel like that, but Wall of Storms paused me. It stopped me in my tracks, and I just kind of was in awe when I finished the book of everything that had happened and how Ken Liu had set it up. And it did give a lot of really cool launching points for the second half of the series. So Wall of Storms deserves this 5th slot, and at one point was my favorite book of the year, but after some reflection, I dropped it just a little bit to number 5.
Number 4. He was 42 years old, and he could see nothing before him that he wished to enjoy, and little behind him that he cared to remember.
It's not fantasy, and the channel's called the Fantasy Network, so that's a little rough. The branding maybe had conflict with my branding, but number 4 was a Patreon pick, and it's Stoner. It's Stoner by John Williams, and the lack of, marijuana was shocking. Has nothing to do with weed or anything like that. No Cheech and Chong. I know some people read that, Stoner, and they're like, No. It's about a very depressed professor who in a lot of ways is so passive that you could just like shake him by his shoulders. I think it serves as a warning about living a very passive life. I do think it also talks about some of the unfairness that we encounter and that fate can have for us. And in the very first pages of the story, we're actually told exactly how it will end and exactly what it's about. And then we dive into it. And I was enthralled in the monotony of this character's life. I absolutely adored it. Stoner is a character that I can relate to more than I would have liked, and in some ways is a character that I never want to be like. But that's the magic in this book, is that it's unflinching in the idea that there are times in our lives where things don't go our way, and then we get to make a decision about how we react to that. And Stoner, in a lot of these positions, in my opinion, did not make the right choice. But I think that can serve as a lesson. And as gritty as it is and as sad as it is, a lot of people end up making those decisions and being passive. And yeah, I don't know. There's a lot to unpack here. But Stoner by John Williams, I've said this all year long, is a book that has no right to be this good, being about just, a middle-of-the-road professor. I mean, it really, it shouldn't have been this entertaining. But Stoner is a book that I will reread multiple times. I think John Williams has some of the best prose style of writing that is somehow so deep and thoughtful without being pretentious, which I'm a bit pretentious, so it is what it is. I don't mind that, but to see someone be able to accomplish this and have such smooth, beautiful writing without, alienating a lot of people is awesome. And it is, without a doubt, probably my favorite middling professor book of all time.
Number 3. Nostalgia was like a disease, one that crept in and stole the color from the world and the time you lived in, made for bitter people, dangerous people, when they wanted back what never was.
Number 3 is The Crippled God by Steven Erikson, wrapping up the Malazan Book of the Fallen main series of the 10 books that Steven Erikson set out to write. The Crippled God accomplished a lot. And not every single thread was tied up. But when I look back at the series, and then I look at the final installment of The Crippled God and what it gave to me and the closure that it did provide, I think it is so congruent with what Erikson was getting across when compassion and all the other themes of the series that people talk about, endlessly. The Crippled God could have went way off kilter. and in some people I have seen say they wish they would have had more threads wrapped up. But for me, it was the feeling of this book. Just a fitting end. And some of the most emotional moments that I've had reading any books ever, fiction, nonfiction, doesn't really matter. Erikson just landed those. And when I turned the final page of Malazan Book of the Fallen, I knew I would never quite experience that kind of journey again. And I immediately opened up Gardens of the Moon and started a slow reread of that, which I did fall off on because there's so much to read. But The Crippled God enhances every single book prior. And I think will also enhance every book after on reread. And that is a testament just to how awesome Steven Erikson is as an author and how awesome Malazan is. This was in the number 1 spot. This has been moved up and down. It's always been in the top 3. It's never left the top 3, which speaks to its quality. And I could have picked Toll the Hounds. I could have picked Dust of Dreams because I actually love Dust of Dreams, unlike a lot of people. But The Crippled God was accomplishing something and ending this tale that has to be weighed in whenever you're talking about how much you love these books. My hot take on Malazan is that I loved all 10. I didn't have a weak book, really. There were times where maybe I struggled with parts, but truthfully, I just enjoyed my entire experience. So for The Crippled God to close all that out and to hit home with me is a win. And it's a victory, and it is my number 3 book of 2022.
Number 2. Whatever in creation exists without my knowledge exists without my consent.
Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. This book, I said this list is all about enjoyment. And I said there were no rereads. Technically, this is a reread because I read it for the first time in November, and then I started a reread immediately after. And I have never done that, except with A Song of Ice and Fire back in the day, wherever I didn't read other books. I just kept reading A Song of Ice and Fire multiple times. But Blood Meridian was one of those books that stuck with me. And my first read through was not the most pleasant experience in the world. I didn't love it out of the box. In fact, I had it kind of towards the middle of my book rankings for Cormac McCarthy. But Blood Meridian challenged me, it pushed me, and it really changed my perspective on how I read books, which I think is super important. And what I mean by that is taking my time. A lot of times we read a ton of books, especially whenever you're doing YouTube and you're doing BookTube or whatever. There is some sort of expectation that you're going to get through a decent amount of books, so you have multiple things to talk about, and that's fine. However, Blood Meridian was the first time, probably since, I would say, A Song of Ice and Fire, where I felt like I was benefiting from slowing down a ton. And it wasn't so much about the finish line as much as it was about living word to word. And there have been other series like this, that another one I'll talk about in just a second. Malazan also comes to mind, A Song of Ice and Fire, Realm of the Elderlings, those kind of things. But Blood Meridian demanded my attention, it demanded my attentiveness, and it got it. And that's why I started rereading it immediately. And if I had enjoyed it thoroughly on the first read through of this, could have been number one. I think it may be the greatest book I've ever read. I think it might be the best book I've ever read, but it's not my favorite. Does that make sense? But I loved reading this. I loved rereading it. And again, getting a different perspective on reading from a book is, that's maybe the biggest praise I can land. I can throw upon a book, but Blood Meridian is brutal, violent, difficult, and dense, but rewarding and introspective. And I think you could probably read this book for the rest of your life. And I will read it probably for the rest of my life. Over and over and over again. And you could pick out new things. There's a lot of subtleties. Some of the stuff is very on the nose, and it is talking about the human condition and handling death, which I think is, I don't want to say required, but for me and my taste in reading, I think that is, every book that I love, that is one of my favorites, deals with death in some way. And this book maybe more than any other. So Blood Meridian has now set me down this path where I want to read all the influence on this, like Paradise Lost, Moby Dick, many, many others, Faulkner, of course. So this is formative. This is formative after, not as a kid, but as an adult. And I think that that's really important to acknowledge. And I think Blood Meridian is a masterpiece. And it is gruesome. It is brutal, but it's excellent.
Number 1. There is a head on a pole behind you. Brutalities spin and scrape like leaves blasted in the wind. He is here, with you, not so much inside me as speaking with your voice. There is a head on a pole behind you. And he walks, though there is no ground, and he sees, though his eyes have rolled into his brow. Through and over, around and within, he flees and he assails, for he is here. Here.
Number 1. The Great Ordeal by R. Scott Baker, which is book 3 in the Aspect Emperor series. It's 3 of 4, and this book would not exist without Blood Meridian. I do have to kind of acknowledge the fact that Aspect Emperor, not so much Prince of Nothing, but Aspect Emperor has so much of Blood Meridian written all over it. It has a lot of other things, but there is a piece of the plot, a subplot in Aspect Emperor that, from my understanding, is almost a 1-for-1 of Blood Meridian from R. Scott Baker's point of view, with his philosophy in a fantasy world of Urwa that is ripe with amazing lore and interesting world building, and just some of my favorite stuff that I've seen in a series, and also some of the hardest things I've ever had to read. So I do have to acknowledge the fact that the Great Ordeal and Aspect Emperor itself probably would not exist without Blood Meridian. But this is where this is a favorite list. And The Great Ordeal was my favorite book that I read in 2022. I read this with a couple different people. One of my good friends, Amanda and Ben, were also reading along with me. And I think we all just kind of stopped. I think it was chapter 4 or 7. I can't really remember what chapter it was. And I read it 5 times before I continued. And then I read it again. I would get maybe 100 pages in the book, and I'd go back again and read this chapter. There is a head on a pole behind you. R. Scott Baker, his brain works different. It's the best way I could explain it. And this book kind of comes at the narrative that was building an Aspect Emperor, especially in the White Luck Warrior, from a totally different angle. And he starts playing with perspective. He starts playing with theology within the world. He starts playing with philosophy in our real world. And it's just really mind-boggling stuff. There is a head on a pole behind you. And I'm not totally sure that everything in the Unholy Consult that came after it landed with me. I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about the ending of Aspect Emperor. I mean, I liked it, but I don't know how much of it I liked. And The Great Ordeal came before this and had some of the most monumental chapters. So that is why The Great Ordeal is winning this. There is a head on a pole behind you. A really interesting fact about this book is apparently R. Scott Baker had some sort of falling out with his editor. I'm not really sure how it worked out, but many people believe that these final two books are largely unedited. There are a ton of spelling mistakes, inconsistency with even so the way some of the things are spelled or the way they're referred to in the world building. So this is not a perfect book. And this is also on this list is the hardest book for me to recommend to you. This is not a number one favorite book of the year. Go out and buy it. This is going to be for a select few amount of people. There is a head on a pole behind you. But there's something about someone who has crafted this world and this story coming at this kind of raw. And the lack of an editor does make the text suffer in the fact that there are blemishes. But seeing his raw ideas being passed to you without any filter that we know of, that's not always the case. That's rare in traditionally published fantasy or fiction or whatever. So you add that on top of this, and then him playing with perspectives, jumping into the second person, really making you question what the hell is even going on and what you're reading. Is he talking to you, the reader? Is he talking to Kellis? I don't know. It's a lot. But this was trippy. It inspects human nature. It does deal with death. And it also deals with the idea of doubt and belief in a way that no other fantasy series has ever accomplished from my taste and in my experience. Now, I have not read everything in the genre, so I'm not trying to make genre sweeping statements. I'm talking about from my subjective reading experience. The Great Ordeal was an absolute trip and blew my mind. And some of the most grotesque things, also some of the more emotional moments, I would say, and what it means to be human and how far do you get away from morality, from society, like when you cross a bridge too far, are you still human? And when you come back on that bridge, are you still human? Can you return to being a human being? I don't know. And I'm not sure R. Scott Baker was giving me an answer in The Great Ordeal or The Unholy Consult or The Aspect Emperor. Really, this number one slot could just go to any of those four books because there has been nothing that has had this kind of gravity to it, this kind of depth to it. And I love the writing style. The writing style is biblical in Cormac McCarthy's kind of way there. Repeated phrases on and on and on that continue to build this theme and continuity throughout the series. There is a head on a pole behind you. But The Great Ordeal has a culmination and some final lines of that book that haunted me in my sleep. And this is a series that, again, I will read many, many times over. It is the toughest book I've ever read to recommend to you. Not really even saying I do. You'll have to make that decision if you read everything it's about and check out my spoiler chats here on the channel. But The Great Ordeal by R. Scott Baker is my favorite number one book of the year for 2022. And I am exhausted. So we're wrapping up the third year-end awards top 10 list here on the Fantasy Network, and it's been an absolute pleasure. I think I got it right. Don't hate me if one of your favorite books wasn't on the list or wasn't high enough for me. Remember, this is my subjective taste. I want to hear what your top 10 books of the year were. Make sure you let me know down in the comments. And if you want to answer the year-end awards that I put out for yourself, put those in the comments below. I know a lot of other people like to read through those. I'm sorry if this is a bit rambly. I have a lot of stuff going on right now in my personal life, and this was a break from that, and this channel has always been somewhat of an escape for me, as is reading a lot of the time. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for checking out this video, for being here all year. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm glad to have you. We're growing, we're excited, we're doing all types of things, long form conversation, book reviews, spoiler chats. I got some other stuff planned, and we'll see how it goes. But I'd love to have you here. So if you like this video, smack like, please. And if you'd love to think about subscribing if you're new here, I'd love to have you a part of the channel. There is a Patreon in the description. It's optional, but always appreciated. And until I see you next time, be good, be safe, and remember to always keep turning the page.
And a big thank you to all my patrons, especially my Kingsguard, which include Lauren, Henrik, Kai, Simon, Oscar, Stewart, Stephen R., Akaika, Amanda, RJ Shaw, Nicoletta Tanner, Jennifer Garrick, Frank C., Evie Fever J., Sarah Pat, Kevin Ryan, Michael Terrence, Wade, Darren, Taylor D., Derry, John C., Boss, Machin, Sebastian, Benjamin, Jobot, Noel, Amanda L., Kyle, C. Scott, Steve Talks Books, and Caitlin, and Dylan M. Thank you all so much. You're the best.